Welcome to today's webinar on produce safety for small farms. Today's speaker is Ariel Agenbroad, and this program is brought to you by a USDA-funded grant and University of Idaho Extension, Washington State University Extension, the Cooperative Extension Service of University of Alaska Fairbanks, and Oregon State University. My name is Colette D. Phelps, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. So I'd like to go over a couple of webinar tips before we start. It might be helpful to you to close all the other programs that are running on your computer, especially if you have limited bandwidth within your internet service. If you do start to experience any problems with sound, clarity, speed, you might want to switch to the telephone. A call-in number is provided in your welcome email, and you can always mute your computer sound when using the phone so you don't get any feedback. There is a question box, and you can type questions in for Ariel at any time. Or if you need any help with some of the technology that's behind this webinar, you can type that into the chat box, and I will be monitoring that. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, so definitely write your questions in as they come to your mind. There will be handouts available to download on your computer from this webinar, so you don't have to write down all the information on the slides. Those will be available through our food safety website, which Ariel will talk to you about, and also through the cultivatingsuccess.org website where you registered for this webinar. With that, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Ariel.
Thank you so much, Colette, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. This is not always an easy subject to dive into, and sometimes it's one that we are hesitant to get into because of misconceptions or anxieties, or maybe we just don't really understand it. So my goal today is to really guide you through what is FSMA, what is the produce safety rule, and how does this affect you as a small farmer or as someone who works with small farmers. And really, what does this mean for your business and for your farm? So when we say FSMA, this is short for the Food Safety and Modernization Act. And FSMA is the lingo. It was signed into law on January 4th, 2011. And what it does is it gives the Food and Drug Administration the authority to regulate food from farm to fork. FDA has been regulating food, prepared food, processed food, restaurants, etc. for many, many, many years. But this is the first time that FDA has taken a closer look at farms. And we'll talk about why that is and why they became involved. So at its most base, it establishes some science-based minimum standards that were identified to really promote safe growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh fruits and vegetables. The focus of this rule, or this law, is definitely on prevention and keeping foodborne illnesses from occurring in the first place. And this is really the first sweeping food safety regulation overhaul that's happened in a very, very long time, decades. And so it came as a little bit of a shock and a surprise, but it's also been being rolled out over a number of years, and with a real focus on education, because the government understood that this is not something that everyone was going to be ready for or even really be receptive to. So there are 7 rules in the Food Safety and Modernization Act that have to do with food production in different capacities and processing. So the produce safety rule is the one that we're going to focus on today, and we do have other webinars scheduled that are going to talk about the processing rule and how that might affect you if you also do value-added processing or any other kind of small-scale food entrepreneurship. But the produce safety rule is the one that really deals with what happens on a farm for those that grow fresh produce. And so it's one of 7 new rules that pertain to all of those different aspects of food production in the United States and abroad. There are the other rules that you may or may not want to look into because they may or may not affect you and your operation, would be the preventative controls for human food. So this is the rule that may affect you if you produce any kind of value-added or commercially processed food. The preventative controls for animal food, so if you're creating pet food or livestock feed, And then the sanitary transportation of human and animal food. This one has to do with the transport of those products. And there are other rules that involve international produce and then also some rules around adulteration of processed or fresh foods. So I do have a video, and I forgot to mention to Colette that I was going to be showing this. It might take me just a second to get it going. So if you hold with me just briefly, we'll get this going. And this really is a good introduction to the produce safety rules. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen of the slideshow and navigate to the video. So give me just 1 minute.
Ariel, just so you know, we cannot see your screen right now. Oh.
All right. So can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Now let's just hope the sound works. Let me change something really quick. No, it's not working. Hold on. Apologize for this really quick. I do apologize. I'm going to try one more thing. And if not, I may have to just send you all the link to the video.
Welcome. This is the first video in a series prepared to educate you on 21 CFR Part 112, Standards for the Growing, Harvesting, Packing, and Holding of Produce for Human Consumption, also known as the Produce Safety Rule. The Food Safety Modernization Act is a science-based approach to proactive food safety from field to fork. This act includes the farthest-reaching changes to food safety laws in the United States since 1938. And is focused on preventing foodborne illness outbreaks by reducing microbial risk. The Food Safety Modernization Act includes 7 new federal rules that address the safety of produce, human food, animal food, transportation, and imported food. The Produce Safety Rule focuses on on-farm activities and established science-based minimum standards for the safe growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce, which is generally consumed raw. The Produce Safety Rule requires operations that conduct these activities comply with the standards set forth in this rule. The Produce Safety Rule sets standards for personnel qualifications and training, health and hygiene, agricultural water, biological soil amendments of animal origin and human waste, domesticated and wild animals, growing, harvesting, packing, and holding activities, equipment, tools, buildings, and sanitation, sprout production, and last but not least, record keeping. As you see here, operations started complying with the standards of the Produce Safety Rule in a staggered schedule, which began in January 2018, with regulatory inspections beginning in 2019 for certain operations. We hope this information is helpful to you as we move forward into these training videos. We have separate video training modules for each part of the Produce Safety Rule. These video modules can be used to teach specific standards and sections of the Produce Safety Rule, or for training about the rule in its entirety. If at any time you have questions regarding how the produce safety rule might apply to you or what compliance with the rule will look like moving forward, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Idaho State Department of Agriculture or University of Idaho Extension. We look forward to assisting you. Thank you for your commitment to produce safety. Let's get started.
All right, so we're going to bring back the slideshow. All right, and I wanted to point out that that video was specifically developed for Idaho, but the rule is universal across states. And we will direct you to a new website that's part of this project where we have your state resources listed for each of the states in the Pacific Northwest that are part of this project. So why is this rule important? Why are we talking about it today? Well, in 2015 alone, the CDC documented that there were over 902 foodborne illness outbreaks reported that resulted in over 15,000 illnesses, almost 1,000 hospitalizations, 15 deaths, and 20 food recalls. So those 15 deaths and those hospitalizations are really, really important. And when you look at the categories of food that are associated with the most outbreak illnesses, seeded vegetables such as cucumbers or tomatoes were actually the highest ranked in terms of being associated with these outbreaks, followed by pork and then vegetable row crops such as leafy vegetables. So it became very important for the Food and Drug Administration to focus on fresh produce as a potential source of contamination and cause of illness. So who or what is to blame? Where is this coming from? So it's actually caused by bacteria, viruses, and parasites, which for the most part are in our environment all the time and are in many of the things that we interact with. However, we're going to talk about when they become a problem. So the important thing here to remember, and this is why I'm so glad that you are on this webinar, is that no farm is too big or too small to be implicated in a foodborne illness outbreak. There have been farms of all sizes that have been associated with some kind of outbreak of foodborne illness. And then when we looked at those numbers, data doesn't tell the whole story. Think about a time when you may have been affected by what you considered to be food poisoning or a foodborne illness. And did you go to the hospital? Did you report it to the CDC? Or did you suffer through and in a day or two got back on your feet and got back to work? So often these cases are unreported or unidentified, or it's really hard to track them back to a source. And the other thing is that person-to-person transmission is often not included in these numbers. So someone may get sick from eating a contaminated produce item, but then they pass that foodborne illness to everyone in their family because it's very easy to transmit these diseases. And so those are often not reported to look at the full picture of what happens. So why are we here to talk about it on small farms? Well, if we go through the rule and we talk about it in detail, you may find out that many small farms are not going to be required to comply with all the new federal food safety regulations. There are some definite minimums that you must meet, and there are also some exemptions that you might be eligible for. However, it's really important to remember that all farms are responsible for producing, packing, transporting, and selling safe food. And how the rule will affect you directly and your farm is going to depend on what you grow, how much you sell, and who your customers are. And I'm also going to point out too that even if you are a small farm and you're not even meeting those minimums to be covered by the rule, if something were to happen on your farm, you can believe that the government is going to get involved and to pay closer attention to what you're doing. So it's really important that you're here and that we talk about these things. So first of all, what produce that's grown is subject to the rule? Well, what we call covered produce, this is going to be produce that is subject to the rule, are any raw agricultural commodities except this very specific and exhaustive list that is currently held by the FDA. So if your food item is on this list in its raw state, it is not subject to the rule. So this includes asparagus, beans, black beans, and these are beans like dried beans, not fresh green beans. Beets, both the garden beets and the tops, sugar beets, cashews, cherries that are sour, chickpeas, cocoa, and coffee that might not affect too many of us here in the Pacific Northwest. Collards, corn, sweet. So sweet corn is not included in this. cranberries, dates, dill, both the seeds and the herbal vegetative portions, eggplants, fig, ginger, hazelnuts, horseradish, lentils, okra, peanuts, pecans, peppermint potatoes, pumpkins of all kinds, winter squashes, sweet potatoes, and water chestnuts. So if you are primarily a sweet corn grower or entirely a sweet corn grower, or you only produce dry beans, then your products are not going to be subject to this rule. So what is not covered by the rule? If it's not on that list, it is covered by the rule. And so if we look at the farms in particular, if you don't grow the covered produce, right, then you are not covered by the rule. If you're growing, if you have a farm and all the produce that you grow is used for personal consumption to feed your family or your employees, or it's all consumed on the farm, then you are not covered by the rule. And then if you're growing raw agricultural commodities like tomatoes or peppers that are covered by the rule, but they all go to processing. This would be true for apples, or any other fruit that's going into processing. You are going to be not covered by the rule, but there are going to be some records that you're going to have to keep to document where your products end up. And then if you are a farm that grosses $25,000 or less, with some adjustments for inflation in produce sales, then you are not covered by the rule. So the very small farms or the hobby farms where this is not the primary source of income, or for any income that is less than $25,000 in produce sales, not covered by the rule. Now, exempt from the rule is a little bit different, right? It's not the same as the rule does not apply to you at all. Exempt means that the rule applies to you in part, but not entirely. So if you sell $500,000 or less of total food, you may be qualified for an exemption from the rule. Now, this is $500,000 of all food produced on your farm, and that includes food that is going to processing, food that is not covered, so all that sweet corn, and any kind of animal food. So it's not the same as produce. It gets really complicated once we start looking deeply into these definitions. But if you are a farm that sells $500,000 less of all total food produced on the farm, and you sell half or more of your products to a qualified end user, you can qualify to be exempt from the rule. And a qualified end user is going to be anything that's basically a direct to the end consumer marketing strategy. So it can include farmers markets, your CSA customers, a retail grocery store, a farm stand, a co-op grocery store, and restaurants. Because again, the idea is it's going to be much easier to trace that product back to you if it goes to one of these outlets versus it goes to a wholesaler and it's spread out among 15, 20 stores, in a region. So does exempt mean totally exempt? And no, it does not. So a qualified exemption means that your farm is not going to be subject to inspection, which can be a good thing for you. And it may not be that you are going to have to keep most of the documentation that is associated with the produce safety rule. So there is a lot of documentation when you are fully covered, and you are subject to an annual inspection if you are covered. If you meet those requirements that we just talked about, you may not have to do those things. However, it doesn't protect your farm from complying with the rule if a foodborne illness or outbreak is traced back to your farm. If that happens, then that exemption is forfeited. And then also you need to keep records that document that your qualified exemption. So these are records about your sales numbers for the farm, and then also who your customers are. And we will link you to some information about where to find record keeping templates and other ways to help make that as easy as possible so that you are prepared, if your State Department of Agriculture or your FDA regulator wants to know if your farm is going to be compliant or not. So are you covered by the rule? Here's what you need to know when you sit down to figure this out. You need to know the types of produce that you grow, your annual gross sales of produce, your annual gross sales of all food produced on the farm, and the percentage sold directly to a qualified end user. And again, we mean an individual or a family, a restaurant, or a local grocery store or retail food store. Now, we're not talking about receipts for every single transaction that you've made, but your tax records probably indicate, where your produce was sold, If you have some kind of record keeping, you know, whether it's the report that you turn into your farmer's market, you know, of your percentage of sales, or it's a contract that you have with a grocery store or a restaurant, these are all going to be the kinds of documents that will help to help you prove those things. So what if it looks like you might be covered? You're large enough and you're selling enough food that you're topping over that $500,000 mark, or you're selling under $500,000 but you're not selling half of your products direct to consumers. Maybe you are working with a wholesaler and your product is going out into the larger market. Well, if you don't meet those minimum requirements for an exemption or qualified exemption, you will likely be required to comply with all parts of the produce safety rule. And if that's the case, then you probably want to reach out to the extension in your state or to your Department of Ag in all the states but Oregon, and even Oregon can certainly help you figure this out. They're just not going to be the regulator for the produce safety rule, and start having that conversation so that you will be prepared. And there are some additional trainings and other things that you need to have completed to be totally compliant. So you saw this slide briefly on the video, and this is just showing some of the dates for compliance. So if you are a qualified exempt farm, right, so you are selling under $500,000 and more than half of it is going to that qualified end user, then you do need to have some records dating back to 2016 that document your income and your end user to meet the requirement for the qualified exemption. We're going to talk about that labeling requirement towards the end. And then these other steps are going to have to do, the first three are for people that are not going to be eligible for a qualified exemption. So they may have to be already compliant or getting ready for inspection and compliance. Yep, so these are the two numbers that as a small farm or a potentially qualified exempt farm that you need to know. Records dating back to 2016, and then following the labeling requirements starting in 2020 or next year, and you'll see it's very simple. I will share an example with you later. So what does this rule do, right? So like I said, it's enlisting a science-based, proactive, preventative approach to managing food safety risks on farms and farm facilities. So it does this by trying to set some standards for how to grow, harvest, pack, and hold produce for human consumption in ways that reduce or eliminate most of the risk for a food safety outbreak. Of course, you can never prevent anything, but this rule really tries to identify the key points where produce might become contaminated and how to avoid that or prevent that from happening. So it includes some very specific requirements, and then a whole lot of suggested activities or best practices. So some of you may be GAP certified or working within the Good Agricultural Practices framework. And so if so, you may be familiar with a lot of what we'll talk about for FSMA. So like GAP, this rule focuses on preventative best practices that are going to minimize those food safety risks. It's really designed to protect the farm and the consumer. And it does require some similar record keeping or documentation that you might be used to doing if you are GAP certified. However, a very key difference from GAP is that GAP, or Good Agricultural Practices, is a third-party certification audit. You enter into that voluntarily or because your markets or your institutions that you sell to or your distributor requires it as a safeguard. But again, it's market driven. There's no laws that require you to be GAP certified. It's just the market may demand that you be GAP certified. Whereas the FSMA produce safety rule is a federal law. And so it affects all farmers, whether you know about the rule or not. And so that's really why we're here, because we want to protect our farmers from, from something that they didn't know was going to affect them. We want to raise that awareness and really help you prepare. So what is covered in the rule? What are these science-based minimums? What are these preventative practices? So the first one deals with personnel qualifications and training. So who is in charge of food safety on your farm? What do they need to know? And what do they do? The second part is for health and hygiene. So what practices are going to reduce risk from human pathogen contamination or transmission? And at its most basic, how are you going to avoid spreading germs and poop and the germs that are in poop? It happens a lot. It's the #1 way that these things are spread. So the third area of the rule deals with agricultural water. So this is all the water that you use to grow, cool, and clean your crops, right? And where is it coming from? Does it pose a hazard? How do you find out? How do you know? It also talks about biological soil amendments of animal origin and human wastes, because these are, again, a key factor in potentially introducing contaminants into a farm environment. So it talks about how manures and composts are managed, and this is a good time for you to look at how those are managed on your farm. And we're going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail throughout the webinar and look at some examples and talk about it. And we also have some webinars scheduled that address a few of these that we feel are most relevant to a small-scale farmer. So domesticated and wild animals, right? Again, we're talking about the manures and the contamination that they may bring in when they're adjacent to growing crops. So what can you do to reduce that risk of contamination? The rule also talks about the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding activities. So what practices reduce the risk as you're going from the field to the pack house to the market? And what are the steps in there that really could contribute to contamination or not? And also looking at your equipment, your tools, your buildings, and your sanitation, right? How do you clean what you're using? How do you sanitize what you're using in your operation? How would you identify and fix risky situations, and how do you manage pests? And then the last section of the rule deals with record keeping. So what required records do you need to keep? What makes good sense to track in your operation? And how would you put this all together? So again, we will be addressing some of these in upcoming webinars, and we really encourage you to reach out to your states and ask them specific questions so that we can continue to develop resources that help you figure this out, answer your questions, and be prepared. So again, what does this mean for small farms? So number one, know where you fit into this picture, right? Are you covered? Are you growing covered produce? So anything that was not on that list of things that were not part of the rule. Are you exempt? Are you qualified exempt? Second, you need to understand the records that you must keep in order to document and prove your exemption. And some states are going to be more aggressive because they have fewer farms. They're going to be looking at everyone, and they may actually, give you a call, or even they may actually even show up on your farm. So be prepared to have these records so that you can prove your exemption. And at least in Idaho, you can preempt this by sending in your qualified exempt form and having a conversation with the Department of Agriculture, and they will just put you on the qualified exempt list, and they won't reach out to you unless there is an issue. And third, realize that the practices that are outlined in the rule will reduce the risk of produce contamination on farms of any size. So they're not entirely arbitrary rules. Some of them may seem overwhelming, some of them may seem arbitrary at first, but really the goal is to reduce that risk of produce contamination. So look at them with an open mind and think about where you can make changes on your farm and where you might have areas of risk. And small farms are often at risk because they are so diversified, because there are a lot of things going on and there's only a few people doing all of it. And so that actually can sometimes make the risk greater in some aspects. All right, so we're going to spend the last half hour of the webinar talking about some of the key elements. But I'm wondering if I should just pause really quick and find out if there have been any questions related to the first part, because that is really the most complicated part of the webinar. And we could answer some of those really quick before we move on.
We don't have any questions yet, Ariel. So just a reminder to participants, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box and we will get those to Ariel to answer. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Colette. All right, so we will dive into these elements. These are each of those 8 elements that we just looked at, and we'll look at them in a little bit greater depth and especially look at them as they relate to a small farm. So first of all, just to go over again, does this really apply to me, right? So again, even if you are an exempt or a qualified exempt farm, you're not required to keep certain records on the practices presented in this next section that I'm going to talk about. For farms that are fully compliant, there are records associated with each of those sections that must be kept and shown to the regulator during inspection. However, again, following these practices is going to lead to increased food safety and sometimes even food quality on your farm. So even if you are not required by law to keep those records, pay attention to these different sections and think about how they might relate to your farm. And the other thing to think about too is if your business grows and you top out that $500,000 mark, you may be compliant. So if you plan to grow, if you plan to increase your farm substantially over the next few years, it would be a good idea to know what you would be facing once you reach that level. So let's talk a little bit about your food safety personnel and the employees on your farm. And some of you may not have employees. It may just be you and maybe or a farming partner or your family. But the people on a farm are really, really important because humans are probably our major food safety concern, probably our most important concern. And that's because people are the ones that contract, share, and transfer pathogens. And we do this when we're sick, when we're injured through blood and bodily fluids, when our hands have been contaminated by any number of items, but most primarily contaminated by human feces, animal feces and manure, contaminated surfaces, and we can also add in clothing, footwear, tools, and equipment to this, and contaminated water. So, you know, we're humans, we touch everything, and our hands are an excellent conduit of materials from one surface to another or from one person to another. So when we're looking at the people aspect, we also want to know who is in charge of food safety on your farm. Now, the rule requires that one individual be identified as the food safety contact or lead for that farm. So again, if it's just you, then you are probably the food safety contact. But even if you're not required to identify someone for this rule, it's a really good idea to identify someone in the farm operation that is in charge of your food safety, right? So this is that individual who will be the point of contact. They'll be responsible for designing and implementing any food safety on your farm. They'll be in charge of keeping the records together and documenting when you're following the recommended practices, and they'll just be the one who's in the know. And again, this should be somebody, unless you really don't have an option, this should be someone who wants to do this job and who is also qualified to do this job. So if we look also at the other people involved in the farm, we're looking at your workers and everyone involved in the production process. It's important to train everyone on your farm's food safety policies and practices. And you might say, well, we don't have any food safety policies. Well, that might be a good place to start, is just looking at what might help guide the right choices and the best practices on your farm. And this can be really difficult, especially when you've done things the same way for a long time, or you have employees that are very, very used to doing things in a certain way, and they are as efficient as they can be in that way. And now we're going to ask them to potentially do something different with their gloves or their aprons or with the way that they transport or move or handle produce. So this is really an important first step. Identify those food safety policies and then train everyone on your farm. And especially for small farms, this may be your family, your employees, but even more important, it may be your customers and visitors to the farm. When we work with large farms on FSMA and the produce safety rule, most of them do not permit visitors on the farm, or if they do, they have very strict visitor policies. Rarely have I been on a small farm where they have any kind of visitor policy, because small farms are often very integrated into their community and they welcome people out to the farm often. So this is really something to think about, maybe looking at a little bit more closely, is when visitors come to your farm, even just having them sign in, just informing them of the policies on your farm. And when you train your employees, try to keep records of that so you know who's been trained on what every year and if anyone is due for an update. A little bit more about visitors to the farm, because many of the small farms we work with have maybe CSA pickups on farm, maybe they even have volunteers come out. They might have a farm stand, or they're often very willing to be a participant in farm tours, and we're always grateful for that in Extension. But when you do have visitors to the farm, make sure that they know where the toilet and hand washing facilities are located and that they have access to them, what activities are allowed or not allowed on the farm. So this can include eating in certain areas, touching certain things, moving from one area to another without supervision, and bringing any animals onto the farm. Let them know what areas of the farm are off limits. This could be where you store your manure. Just don't go over there. Stay in this area. What kinds of sanitation or protective gear do you require? Often, even small-scale livestock operations are going to require boot covers for any visitor on the farm, especially if they're coming from another operation where there might be livestock and diseases might be transmitted between animals. So again, that wouldn't be a food safety concern, but this would be a biosecurity concern on your farm. And you can use signage if appropriate. So we have some example signs for visitors to the farm. We can also continue to help you develop what this might look like on your farm and share examples with you. So next we're going to talk about water. This is a big one. This is probably the most contentious of all the sections, especially for large farms and especially for farms on the west that irrigate their crops and irrigate them in many, many different ways with many different water sources and often are all sharing the same water resources. So it can be really a complicated issue, and it actually is one that the FDA is still, as of this webinar in May 2019, are still working on finalizing for the version of the rule. So like I said, the section that governs agricultural water for farms is yet to be finalized. But let's just talk about the definitions, because this is really the important thing to think about. So agricultural water in the produce safety rule is defined as water that is used in production, and so that's your irrigation water. It can be your water in spray mixes if you're using water for frost protection, etc. It's any water that is likely to contact produce. So if you have drip irrigation in an orchard, that is not necessarily ag water unless you have a break in the irrigation or the drip system and water is sprayed onto the fruit. So for row crops, in-ground crops, most of your irrigation water is going to count as agricultural water. In orchards, you might have a little bit more flexibility. But again, water lines can break. So all agricultural water must be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. So again, this is not requiring that the water be potable, but there are some minimum contamination levels that you must meet. And if your water does not meet that, then there are recommendations for waiting a period of time for die-off or for treating water. And the rule does set some minimum standards for irrigation water quality and testing whether the water is coming from an irrigation canal, whether it's coming from a private or public well, or a municipal city water source. So agricultural water after harvest, this is where it's a little bit more specific. So this is any water that comes in contact with fresh produce during and after harvest. So this could be anything that you're using for rinsing, washing, if you're conveying produce with water, whether you're cooling it, making ice, applying any post-harvest fungicide or wax applications, and any water that you're using for hand washing during these activities. So this water, because it could so easily become contaminated with pathogens and transmit these to produce or to other people, the rule requires that you only use potable water for post-harvest activities. So this is water that is 100% free of any detectable E. coli. And so in this case, is usually tested well water or municipal city water are the best choices for this, unless you have some kind of water treatment option on your farm, but most small farms do not. And just a really quick visual to show which waters are more likely to have a risk of contamination. And so surface water, this would be your pond, your irrigation canal, your lagoon water. It has a higher risk of contamination because it is open at all times to the environment. Deer can walk in, cows can come in and die in that water. It can easily be contaminated by a number of sources. Groundwater is somewhere in the middle, so this is often your well water. And then a public water supply that is processed and tested does have a lower risk of contamination in general. So how to reduce your risk when you're using water. So know your water. Where does it come from? Identify your water sources. Even if you are not required by the rule to do so, which a qualified exempt grower would not be required to test water, it's a really good idea to keep records for your public water supply. Just keep them on hand so that you can refer to them. Test your well water annually, and this is a good idea for you as a consumer of that water if you use it for your household, as well as if you use it in your agricultural production. And consider testing your water throughout the season. Again, the rule is going to set some minimums for how to do this, but you can certainly do this even on a small farm basis if you think that there might be a concern. And one of the biggest arguments in the West is that, our water is changing from day to day and from season to season, depending on who's upstream for us, who's downstream, and what's going on. So again, this is being addressed by the rule, and we don't have all the answers yet. You can also really work on any scale to protect your water. So where are your wastes going? Are your livestock having access to your surface water? Do wildlife have easy access to your surface water? And how often do you inspect your own well and your wellhead and your irrigation systems? So the next section is going to focus on the biological amendments of animal origin. And so particularly we're talking about manures and composts here. And we're also going to talk a little bit about human waste, but not too much. So this section of the rule is going to really talk about the use of any kind of biological soil amendment that comes from an animal. So manures, composts that were made with manure, compost and manure teas, and any other kind of biological amendment. So why should you be concerned? Well, animal manures are often a very vibrant source of bacteria, viruses, or parasites, and they can easily make people sick if they are used as a soil amendment in raw state and they come in contact with the edible portion of the growing crops. If they're contaminating hands, clothes, shoes, equipment, and tools, and then coming in contact with fresh produce, or if they are being stored in a way that allows for leaching, drift, or runoff into surface water, into production fields, or packing or harvesting areas. So how do you reduce the risk of soil amendments of animal origins on your farm? This is really one that has not come up too much in our presentations, but you never know. So never use human waste to fertilize crops. If you have a source of human waste compost and you're really intent on using it, there are some guidelines through the EPA that may potentially make this acceptable to FSMA, but if you have any other option, I would recommend that you go that direction. If you're going to be composting on farm and you want to use those manure, use that compost at any stage of the growing season, so maybe you want to top dress, a few weeks before you're going to harvest, then you must use a scientifically valid method of composting to treat raw manures. And again, I should be clear, this is if you are going to be compliant with the rule, but it is a good idea to follow this just from a food safety standpoint. So if you are not going to use that scientifically valid method of composting, you're not keeping records of the time and temperature of your compost, you can reduce your risk by allowing a time interval of 90 to 120 days between application of that compost and harvest. And this is currently what the organic standard requires for the Federal Organic Program. And right now, FDA is accepting this as suitable until they've concluded their own research. And so 90 days would be application of raw manure or anything composted not using a tested method. 90 days between the addition of that and anything that is coming in and it's grown above ground, and 120 days between application and harvest of crops that grow on the ground or in contact with the compost. And it just makes sense to really carefully store, manage, and transport any of your raw and treated soil amendments separately. Because if you go to all the process of composting and composting correctly, and then it becomes contaminated again with raw manure, then it all becomes untreated again. So let's talk a little bit about animals on the farm. So we've got wildlife, livestock, and pets that can all be present on a small or large farm. And animals of all kinds are often a constant presence on many small farms, again, because they are so diversified and they're running cropping and livestock systems. And often they have working animals as well, whether they are draft horses or working dogs or anything else. So the other thing is that animals and their waste products, like we talked about with the manures, can contaminate fresh produce. So think about what are the potential sources for animal intrusion or contamination on your farm. Is it livestock? Is it wild animals and wildlife? Is it your own domestic pets? Is it the domestic pets of others in, in your region or neighborhood? And then can conservation and farming coexist? Absolutely. The rule does not specify, even if you were to be covered by it, it does not specify that you have to exclude all wildlife from your farm, because that is impossible. But how do you look at encouraging wildlife to visit other parts of the farm versus your production areas? And then how do you manage your livestock in order to keep them and their waste products separate from any kind of fresh produce? So know your risks. Look at where animals are likely to be on your farm and where your susceptible or sensitive crops may be. As much as possible, exclude wildlife, livestock, birds, and pets whenever possible from areas where you're actively growing produce. And inspect your crops during the growing season and pre-harvest, and look for any signs of intrusion or contamination. And this is something that we train all farmers to identify, and then also to train their harvesters, is train yourself and your workers to not pick poop. So just leave any contaminated produce in the field. If you handle it, then it has the risk of contaminating your hand, and then you go to handle other produce, or it's going to contaminate produce in harvest bins, etc. So just leave it there. So let's talk a little bit about harvesting and packing. A little bit about sanitation from harvest to market, right? This is how your produce is handled as it goes from the field to the consumer. And this is really important because we're getting to that end chain. There are many opportunities along the way for produce to become contaminated with pathogens. After you've done everything right in the field, it would really be a shame for things to happen at this point that make the produce contaminated. So think about how your produce is harvested, handled, cooled, washed, packed, stored, transported, and/or displayed. And are there any areas along that chain that could be improved or changed or in some way altered? And what are the risks associated with each step along this continuum? And we are going to have a webinar here in a few weeks that's focused just particularly on sanitation from harvest to market for small farms. So your most important areas to look at when you're identifying these risks are surfaces of any kind that do or could come in contact with fresh produce. So this is everything from your harvest tool and totes to your gloves and aprons, your tables, conveyor belts, storage bins, your packaging materials, any kind of storage racks, your coolers, your walk-in refrigerators, your transportation, your trucks, your vehicles, and very, very importantly, worker hands, worker clothing, and then again, even the walls, ceilings, and floors of your facility. So can these all be adequately inspected, cleaned, and if necessary, sanitized? That's a good question mark. That would be where I would start in analyzing your operation for risk in post-harvest. Pest management is another key aspect of this. And again, this is how you are going to manage pests in your packing, storage, or cooling facilities. And we're talking about reducing that risk of contamination primarily from rodents and birds, though insects could be a problem if they built up enough of a population. And the rule recommends maintaining a regular schedule where you inspect, trap, remove, and keep records about your pest management activities. Now, if you were going to be a covered farm and compliant with the rule, this would be an area where you had to keep records. But for your farms, if you are going to be qualified exempt, you do not have to keep these records, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to just start to keep a general log of your pest management activities. All right, so now we're going to go into the last bit, which is record keeping, and then we'll have some time for questions. So here are just a few different examples of some forms that you might want to keep around. And again, this worker training record template, this is not required by the rule if you are exempt. But this qualified exemption template, something along these lines is required, and not particularly this template, but this is a really easy way to keep this information. Okay. So I'm going to give you a quick record keeping checklist, and this is for farms that are not at all covered by the rule because they are making less than $25,000 on the sales of their produce. So if you are this very, very small farm that's selling under $25,000, then you need to keep sales documents or tax information showing your produce sales, adjusted for inflation, averaged over 3 years, dating back to January 1st, 2016. If you are a qualified exempt farm, right, so you have met those requirements, you need to keep sales or tax documents that show your total food sales are averaging under $500,000 per year over 3 years, adjusted for inflation, beginning in 2016. And documentation that your direct sales to qualified end users exceed your sales to all other buyers, right? So this is 50%, more than 50% of your sales are going to that qualified end user, that farmer's market customer, the CSA customer, a retail grocery, a co-op, or a restaurant. And then by 2020, you will be required to prominently and conspicuously display your farm name and complete business address at the point of sale. So these are the only 3 things that you will need to do by law to be in compliance with the rule if you are a qualified exempt farm. So that's not very much to do, but it is important that you keep these records. And so let's look at an example of that labeling. So here would just be an example, right? And this would be required to be on display at your farmer's market booth, at your farm stand or your CSA pickup, or if you're delivering produce, you would have, you know, something with this information on the produce that you were delivering. I mean, some farms are going to the point that they're putting this on all of their product labels or their packaging, and that's absolutely fine too. Then they remember where it came from, so that can always be good. And again, you have until January 2020 to design and develop this. And again, most farms that I see have business cards sitting on their tables or some other way to identify themselves, because you want your customers to know who you are. So you can see it has the name of the company, a mailing address. It does not have to necessarily be the farm business address. It just needs to be a way to reach them. And then your city and your zip code. So records and farm food safety plans, right? So if you are GAP certified, you probably have a farm food safety plan. However, the produce safety rule does not require you to have a set food safety plan. But we really think it's a great idea. And we think that having that written plan helps a farm, no matter what size, really focus in on food safety. It helps you keep organized, have all of those records and all of that documentation and all those policies in one place. So you could keep your worker records, the policies that you give to your employees, the policies that you give to visitors, all of your sales records related to the rule, all of that could be in one location. It can help you keep track of important records, and it can also help you to know what to do if a situation were to occur, right? Who would you reach out to? What would you go back to and say, well, we did X, Y, Z right. You know, we don't know how this would have happened. So just to summarize, right, the FDA Food Safety and Modernization Act and the Produce Safety Rule affects all farms of all sizes, whether they're aware of the rule or not. Some very, very small farms are not going to be covered by the rule, and some farms will be eligible for a qualified exemption, and they'll have modified requirements to follow. But all farms will continue to be under increasing pressure to grow, harvest, and sell safe food to their customers. And I think that's going to continue to be the case. And I think that large farms are going to want to know that small farms are doing their part as well. And I think continually customers, whether that is the individual, whether it's the co-op, whether it is the restaurant, are going to want to know that they have that assurance of food safety when they buy your products. So we have a website now for this project, and all the additional webinars have been scheduled. So if this is something that you really are trying to get up to speed about, if you have employees that need this training, this is actually the first in a series a few weeks ago. We've now had several of these iterations going on. This is the second broadcast of this particular subject. But we have a 4-state collaboration to prepare small-scale growers for FSMA. And here is the web address where you can find a lot more information about each of the states involved and state-specific resources. And we're continually adding new things to that website including we have a goal to create something that'll help you quickly determine your level of coverage under the rule. So that's www.pnwfoodsafety.org. And I am going to let Colette take it back and explain what else is coming up that, that Cultivating Success is putting on, and then we will do a couple questions.
Great, thank you, Ariel. Here is the website for the Cultivating Success program. We have several webinars that are coming up for small farms. If you just go to the webinar address here, www.cultivatingsuccess.org, and click on Idaho, you'll come to this screen where you can click on our webinar series and register for any of the upcoming webinars. You can also view any past webinars. This is also the location that you're going to be able to find the slide handout from today's webinar. I also wanted to point out that under the programs section of this webinar, if you click on that, you will see the 2018 webinar series, and you will be able to go look at those recordings as well. If you have any questions, you can email info@cultivatingsuccess.org, and we will get back to you right away. As Ariel said, there are many food safety resources on the food safety website, and our next webinar, which will be next week, is going to be an introduction to the preventative controls in human food rule, which relates to processing, and a good portion of the webinar is going to focus on whether or not the rule applies to you as a small farmer. So with that, thank you very much. We didn't have any questions on today's webinar. We appreciate your time, and we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar.
Great, and if you do have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to me, or you can contact representatives from Idaho, Washington, Oregon, or Alaska on that pnwfoodsafety.org site.
Great. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.